The air in the penthouse smelled of expensive ozone and decaying ambition. Dominic Corleone stared at the mahogany board, his fingers trembling, not from fear but from the electric thrill of a victory stolen from the gods themselves. For 12 hours, the silence had been heavy enough to crush a lesser man's ribs. Across from him sat a figure draped in shadows, a man whose presence felt like a draft from an open grave, yet Dominic had done it. He had bluffed. He had moved a night when the shadows weren't looking. He had rigged the world. Hello to all of you joining us today. Before we dive deeper into this descent, I want to say how much I appreciate you being here. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. How are you all doing? If you're finding yourself gripped by this mystery already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to ensure you never miss a chapter of these emotional journeys we take together. Dominic's heart hammered against his sternum, a frantic bird in a ribcage cage. He had just won the bloodless gambit, the secret ritual that decided which family would rule the city's concrete veins for the next decade. He had cheated destiny. He had won. But as the first gray light of dawn bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the skyscraper, the victory curdled. Dominic tried to smirk, to offer the ageless stranger a mocking checkmate, but his face wouldn't obey. A sudden agonizing heat crawled beneath his skin, like millions of microscopic needles stitching through his muscles. He reached up, his hand shaking, to touch his jaw. It was locked in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't scared, not yet, but his face was screaming. I won, he tried to rasp, but his voice came out as a strangled sob. He looked into the vanity mirror across the room and recoiled. His eyes were wide, pupils blown, reflecting a soul stripped naked. Every dark thought, every flicker of the guilt he had buried since he was a boy, every lie he had ever told his wife was written in the twitch of his lip and the furrow of his brow. He looked like a man watching his own execution. Then he turned back to the table. The board hadn't moved. The ivory pieces sat exactly where they were at 3 a.m. And the stranger, the man he had thought walked out minutes ago, was still there. He was leaning forward, the light catching the unnatural stillness of his eyes. "The house ruled, Dominic," the stranger whispered, and the sound felt like ice water down Dominic's spine. "You may cheat men. You may cheat the law. But you cannot cheat the game that decides destiny." Dominic tried to project strength, to call for his guards, but his face betrayed him with a pathetic, whimpering grimace that revealed his utter helplessness. "Look out the window, Dominic," the stranger commanded. Dominic's legs moved like lead. Below, in the city he thought he had just secured, a black plume of smoke rose from the docks. His main warehouse. His men. The move he made with his rook, the one where he had tucked a spare piece up his sleeve, was playing out in the real world. Only in reality the rook wasn't a piece of ivory. It was his brother. And the smoke meant his brother was gone. The stranger stood, the chess pieces beginning to glow with a sickly, rhythmic light. "Each move you made tonight is a life you forfeit. Each lie you told is a wound you will feel. The game is just beginning, and for the first time in your life, Dominic, everyone can see exactly how much you're hurting." The question hanging in the freezing air wasn't whether Dominic would survive the night. It was, how does a man who lives by deception survive a world where he can no longer hide his soul? To understand the magnitude of the catastrophe unfolding, one had to understand who Dominic Corleone truly was before the dawn broke his reflection. He was a man built on the architecture of the stone face. In the underworld of the city, Dominic was a ghost, unreadable, untouchable, and utterly devoid of visible empathy. He believed that an emotion was a target you painted on your own chest, and he had spent 40 years making sure no one ever saw his heart beat. His deepest desire wasn't just money, it was the ultimate security of a world he could predict. He was a man obsessed with variables. He had grown up the son of a low-level enforcer who died because he wore his temper on his sleeve. Dominic had vowed never to be that vulnerable. His motivation was the preservation of the Corleone legacy at any cost, even the cost of his own humanity. But beneath that iron exterior lay a fear that gnawed at him in the dark, the fear that he was, at his core, a hollow shell who had traded love for leverage. As the stranger watched him with those predatory, unblinking eyes, Dominic's mind raced toward the people who anchored him to a reality that was now dissolving. First there was Isabella Hunt, his wife. She was the only person who had ever come close to seeing behind his curtain. Isabella was a woman of sharp intellect and soft edges, a high-end art restorer who spent her days fixing things that time had broken. Their marriage was a complex dance of secrets. She knew what he was, yet she chose to believe in the man he pretended to be when the lights were low. Dominic loved her with a desperate, silent intensity, but he had never told her, not truly. He had always been afraid that if he confessed his love, he would give her the power to destroy him. Now, as his face twisted into a grotesque mask of raw, weeping longing, he realized he might never get to speak a truth that wasn't a scream. Then there was his younger brother Vito Sullivan, the rook of his operation. Vito was the fire to Dominic's ice. He was charismatic, reckless, and fiercely loyal. Vito was the one who handled the street-level negotiations, the one who smiled at the enemies before the blades came out. Dominic had always looked down on Vito's inability to hide his feelings, calling it a weakness. But as the smoke continued to billow from the docks below, Dominic felt a phantom pain in his chest. He had used a forbidden move during the game, a double step with his rook to bypass a defensive line. In the game it was a masterstroke of cheating. In reality, it meant he had sent Vito into a trap without backup just to secure a shipping route. The third pillar of his life was Julian Thorne, his oldest friend and consigliere. Julian was a man of shadows, a strategist who helped Dominic rig the very game he was currently losing. They had shared secrets that would burn the city down. But as Dominic looked at the stranger, he saw a flickering image on the surface of the mahogany table. Julian sitting in a car, a phone to his ear, his face pale. The secret they shared, a betrayal of a rival family years ago, was bubbling to the surface. Julian wasn't just his ally, he was the keeper of Dominic's darkest sins. The room began to feel smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of these connections. Dominic tried to force his mind to strategize, to find the play that would fix the dock fire and save Vito. But every time he thought of a lie to tell the police or a threat to send to his rivals, his face would spasm. His eyes would dart with guilt. His mouth would hang open in a silent, ugly confession of his own cowardice. The stranger stood up and walked toward a cabinet, pouring a glass of Dominic's most expensive scotch. He didn't offer any to the boss. "You think you are the architect of your life, Dominic," the stranger said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "You think the people in your life are pieces you can sacrifice to keep your king safe. But look at you now. You can't even keep your own eyebrows from telling the world how much you regret that move at 2 a.m. Dominic's face contorted into a look of such profound, gut-wrenching grief that he felt his own soul might split. He was thinking of the time he had lied to Isabella about why he came home with blood on his cuffs. He had told her it was an accident. Now, looking in the mirror, his face was stuck in the expression he should have had that night. A mask of murderous, cold-blooded intent. He realized then that the stranger wasn't just playing a game of chess. He was performing an autopsy on Dominic's life while he was still alive to feel it. The supporting cast of his life, Isabella, Vito, Julian, weren't just observers. They were the stakes. And because he had cheated to protect them, he had actually ensured their destruction. The mystery deepened as the stranger pointed to a piece Dominic hadn't noticed before. A white queen stained with a single drop of real blood, sitting on a square that shouldn't have been reachable. "Who is she, Dominic?" the stranger asked. "The one you didn't even tell Julian about? The one who represents the only move you ever made out of genuine kindness." Dominic's face didn't just show fear then. It showed a shattering, light-filled hope that was quickly drowned by a wave of absolute despair. He had a daughter, a child kept in a convent far from the city, a secret he had guarded more fiercely than his own life. The game was no longer about power. It was about the fact that every person he loved was now a piece on a board he could no longer control, and his enemies, the ones he had cheated, were about to see his every weakness written in the lines of his face. The silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the vibration of Dominic's phone against the mahogany table. It rattled with the persistence of a dying heartbeat. Dominic reached for it, his movements jagged, but his hand stopped mid-air. His face, that traitorous canvas of skin and muscle, was currently contorted into a grimace of such profound sickly dread that he didn't need to see the caller ID to know what it was. The stranger gestured with a skeletal hand toward the device. "Answer it, Dominic. The first move of the morning has been played. You moved your knight to e5 at 1:14 a.m. You jumped over your own defenses to strike at a vulnerable heart. Now the world responds. Dominic grabbed the phone. It was Isabella Hunt. Dominic, her voice came through brittle and shaking. Dominic, something is wrong. There are men outside the gallery. They aren't your men. They look like they're waiting for something. And Julian won't answer his phone. Dominic, talk to me. Tell me I'm safe. Dominic opened his mouth to deliver the practiced, steadying lie he had used 1,000 times. Everything is under control, sweetheart. Stay inside. I'm sending a car. But as the words formed in his mind, his face betrayed him with a violent, involuntary spasm. His eyes rolled back slightly, his jaw dropped in a look of paralyzed, pathetic helplessness, and a sound like a wounded animal escaped his throat. He couldn't lie. The stone face was dead. If he tried to tell her she was safe, his voice would crack and his face would show her the truth, that he had sacrificed her security to win a territorial dispute 3 hours ago. Isabella. He wheezed, his face twisting into a mask of agonizing guilt. Run. You have to leave now. Why do you sound like that? She whispered, the terror in her voice spiking. Dominic, what did you do? He hung up because he couldn't bear to let her see him through the phone. He turned to the stranger, his face now etched with a murderous rage that looked like a physical wound. What is this? What did you do to me? I did nothing but remove the veil, the stranger replied, casually sliding a black bishop across the board. You spent your life believing that if no one saw your fear, you were brave. If no one saw your guilt, you were innocent. I have simply synchronized your outside with your inside. It is the only honest way to play. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse burst open. It wasn't his guards. It was Julian Thorne. Julian stumbled in, his tailored suit torn, his face ashen. He stopped dead when he saw Dominic. He didn't see the boss. He saw a man whose face was a flashing neon sign of every secret they had ever buried. Julian's eyes widened in horror. Dominic? Your face. What's happening to your face? Julian stepped back, his hand moving toward his holstered weapon. You look like you're about to confess to the deed. You look like you've already given us up. This was the first major plot twist. The very men who served him would now see his internal doubts as evidence of betrayal. In the Mafia, a leader who looks guilty is a leader who is about to flip. Julian, wait, Dominic tried to say, but his expression was stuck in a look of shifty, sideways calculation. The look of a man wondering if he should kill his best friend to save himself. It was a thought Dominic hadn't even fully processed yet, but the game was pulling it to the surface. You're selling me out, Julian breathed, his voice turning cold. I can see it on you. I've known you 30 years and I've never seen that look. You're clearing the board, aren't you? You're the one who told the police about the warehouse. You're the one who let Vito get cornered. No, Dominic screamed, but his face was nodding. A rhythmic, horrifying tick of his head that suggested a hidden yes. The stranger laughed, a sound like glass grinding together. The game reflects the truth, Dominic. At 2:45 a.m. you considered sacrificing your bishop to protect your king. Julian is your bishop. Your mind went there and now your face stays there. Julian pulled his gun. The brotherhood that had ruled the city's shadows for decades dissolved in a single second of visual honesty. I'm not going to be your sacrifice, Dominic. But before Julian could pull the trigger, the penthouse windows blew inward. A flashbang grenade turned the world white. Through the ringing in his ears and the stinging smoke, Dominic felt a hand grab his collar. It wasn't Julian. It was a woman he didn't recognize. A sleek, lethal-looking operative in tactical gear. She didn't work for him. She didn't work for his enemies. She looked at Dominic's twisted, honest face and smirked. So the rumors are true. The great Corleone has lost his mask. My employers have been waiting for this bloodless gambit to fail. You cheated the game, Dominic, and now the board is being flipped. She didn't kill him. Instead, she dragged him toward the private elevator. We need you alive. Only the man who played the game can finish it. But first, you're going to watch what happens to your queen when she finds out who you really are. As the elevator doors closed, Dominic caught a glimpse of the chessboard one last time. The stranger was gone, but a new piece had appeared on the board. A small wooden figurine of a child. His secret daughter. The house wasn't just taking his empire. It was coming for the only thing he had ever tried to keep pure. Dominic's face, reflected in the polished chrome of the elevator, was no longer just afraid. It was the face of a man who realized he was no longer the player. He was just another pawn and he was being moved into a direct line of fire. Dominic sat in the back of a blacked-out SUV, flanked by the operative who called herself Elena Velasquez. Every time he tried to center his thoughts to build a mental wall against the chaos, his face would betray him. He felt a muscle in his cheek twitch rhythmically, an involuntary signal of his growing panic. Beside him, Elena watched him with a scientist's detached curiosity. "It's fascinating," she murmured, her voice a cool blade in the dark. "Most men in your position would be screaming or begging. You're trying to do both, but only your eyes are succeeding. Your mouth looks like it's trying to swallow a secret that's too large for your throat." Dominic's face spasmed into a look of visceral, oily disgust. He wasn't disgusted by her. He was disgusted by the memory of the bribe he'd paid to the city council 3 years ago. A bribe that had indirectly led to the construction of the very building they were now speeding toward. The game was pulling every thread of his history. "Before we continue, I have to ask, how would you handle it? If every dark thought you ever had was written on your forehead for the person you love most to see, would you stay or would you run? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious if anyone thinks they could survive this. And if you're enjoying the tension, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep these stories coming." The SUV screeched to a halt in front of the Hunt Gallery. Dominic's heart nearly stopped. Through the glass facade he saw Isabella. She was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by his own loyal guards. Only they weren't protecting her. They were holding her. At the front of the group stood Julian Thorne, his face a mask of cold fury, his gun pressed against the side of Isabella's head. "Out," Elena commanded, shoving Dominic toward the pavement. As Dominic stumbled into the gallery, the transition was jarring. The smell of oil paint and expensive wine was choked out by the scent of cordite and sweat. Isabella's eyes found his, and for a second the world went silent. She looked for the man who had kissed her goodbye that morning, the man with the steady gaze and the reassuring smile. Instead she saw a monster of honesty. Dominic's face was a flickering strobe light of agony. As he looked at her, his expression shifted from a desperate, weeping love to a jagged, sharp-edged guilt. He remembered the move at 4 a.m., the Queen's sacrifice. He had allowed a rival family to believe Isabella's gallery was a front for money laundering just to distract them from his own offshore accounts. He had painted a target on her back to save his wallet. And now she could see it. She could see the betrayal written in the way his eyes refused to hold hers, in the way his lip curled in a self-loathing snarl. "Dominic," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What does that look? Why are you looking at me like I'm already dead?" I had to." Dominic started, but his face shook, "No," with a violence that nearly knocked him off balance. His expression was a screaming confession. "I chose the power over you." Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Look at him, Isabella. He's not even trying to deny it. He's a walking confession. He sold you out to the Volkovs 4 hours ago. He used you as a pawn to protect his bloodless gambit. Isn't that right, boss?" Dominic tried to move toward her, to explain that he was trapped in a game he didn't understand, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. This was the obstacle the stranger had warned him about, the weight of the moves. Every inch he moved toward Isabella felt like he was dragging the bodies of everyone he'd ever hurt behind him. Suddenly, a red dot appeared on Julian's chest. Then another on Dominic's. The mercenaries weren't there to save anyone. They were there to harvest the remains. "The board is crowded," Elena said, stepping into the gallery. "Julian, you're an old variable. Isabella, you're a liability. And Dominic, you're the only one who can sign over the digital keys to the city's infrastructure. The keys you won tonight." The tension ratcheted up to a breaking point. Outside, the sounds of sirens grew louder, but they weren't police sirens. They were the private security forces of the families Dominic had cheated. They were coming for his head. Dominic looked at Isabella. In this moment of extreme adversity, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. A genuine, unforced surge of protective rage. For the first time, his face didn't spasm with guilt. It hardened. It settled into a look of such singular, lethal intent that even Julian flinched. It was the first sign of character growth. Not through deception but through the acceptance of his own darkness. He stopped trying to hide what he was. He leaned into it. "Julian, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a gravelly resonance. You think you see my tells? You think you know what I'm going to do because my face is honest? Dominic stepped forward, ignoring the red dot on his heart. His face was a mask of absolute terrifying certainty. The game said I can't lie, Dominic growled, his eyes locked on Julian's. So believe me when I tell you this. If you don't drop that gun, I'm going to kill you with my bare hands, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it. Look at my face, Julian. Do you see a bluff? Julian stared. He looked at the raw, unadulterated bloodlust on Dominic's face. There was no hesitation. No flicker of doubt. For the first time, the honesty wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. But then the midpoint revelation hit like a freight train. Elena stepped between them, holding a tablet. Touching sentiment, Dominic. Truly. But you're missing the most important piece on the board. She turned the screen around. It was a live feed of a small, sun-drenched courtyard in a convent 300 miles away. A young girl no older than 7 was playing with a wooden horse. The stranger didn't just give you tells, Dominic, Elena whispered. He gave us the map. Every move you made in that penthouse created a physical link to the things you value. You moved your bishop to save your queen, but you left your pawn entirely unprotected. Dominic's face didn't just drop. It disintegrated. The mask of the killer vanished, replaced by the raw, shivering terror of a father. That's not a pawn, Dominic breathed, his voice a ghost of itself. In this game, everything is a piece, Elena said. And the move you made at 5 a.m., the one where you cheated to win the final pot? That move just put a check on that little girl's life. The realization shattered him. The game wasn't mirroring his life. His life was being consumed by the game. And the most horrifying twist was yet to come. The stranger wasn't a demon or a ghost. He was the architect of the very system Dominic had used to build his empire, and he was finally calling in the debt. The air in the gallery grew thin, as if the reality of the situation was sucking the oxygen out of the room. Dominic stood paralyzed, his face a strobe light of agony, reflecting the feed of his daughter on the tablet. The stone face was a memory. Now he was a man made of glass, and the cracks were widening. Dominic's knees buckled, not out of physical weakness, but because the weight of the game had finally reached his center of gravity. He looked at the tablet, then at Elena, and finally at Julian, who still held the gun to Isabella's head. But something was shifting. The honesty, that had been a curse for the last 2 hours, was beginning to deepen into something far more profound. You think you know who he is, Dominic whispered, his eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room, expecting the ageless stranger to manifest out of the dust motes. The man at the board. You think he's a ghost or a devil? He's a legend, Elena countered, her voice sharp. The arbiter. The one who ensures the families don't destroy the city by providing a ritual to settle the score. You're the first person in a century to try and rig his table. Dominic let out a laugh that sounded like dry bones breaking. His face twisted into a look of such absolute cosmic irony that Elena actually flinched. The honesty was no longer just showing his fear. It was showing his sudden, terrifying understanding. He's not the arbiter, Dominic gasped, the truth tearing through him. I looked at his hands when I made the last move. I saw the ring. The same ring my father wore. The same ring you wear, Julian. Julian's hand trembled. The gun barrel chattered against Isabella's temple. What are you talking about, Dominic? I don't have a ring like that. Not on your finger, Dominic roared, his face burning with a revelation so intense it seemed to illuminate his very skin. In your mind. The game isn't a supernatural event. The stranger. He's the personification of the consensus. This was the game-changing twist. The bloodless gambit wasn't a mystical ritual. It was a sophisticated, high-tech psychological theater designed by the collective heads of the 5 families. The stranger was a world-class mentalist and chemist, and the game had been played under the influence of a truth serum derivative, a neurotoxin that paralyzed the facial muscles' ability to lie. Dominic hadn't cheated a god. He had walked into a trap set by his own peers to see if he was fit to lead. But there was a second, darker layer to the revelation. The girl, Dominic said, his face softening into a look of such pure, vulnerable fatherhood that Isabella let out a sob. She's not just a pawn. She's the only reason I played. I didn't want the city, Julian. I wanted the exit. Dominic reached into his coat and pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper. The real move he had made at 3 a.m. wasn't a cheat to win power. It was a legal move that, if completed, would have liquidated his entire empire and distributed it among the other families in exchange for his and his daughter's total disappearance. I wasn't rigging the outcome to win, Dominic confessed, his face a map of sacrifice. I was rigging the outcome to lose everything so I could finally be a father. I cheated because the rules wouldn't let a boss just walk away. The only way to save her was to burn the board. The room went silent. The romantic connection with Isabella, which had been frayed by his lies, suddenly surged back. She looked at him, not as the crime boss she feared, but as the man she had always hoped he was. She saw the truth on his face. He had been trying to save her and a child she never knew existed. Dominic, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. But the stakes were now at their highest point. Elena realized that Dominic wasn't a traitor to the families. He was a traitor to the system of power itself. And in their world, a man who wants to leave is more dangerous than a man who wants to rule. It doesn't matter why you did it, Elena said, her eyes cold. The consensus doesn't allow for exits. The move is made. At 6 a.m. the checkmate activates. If the transition of power isn't signed, the convent is leveled. If it is signed, you die and the girl is adopted by the syndicate. Dominic stood tall. The spasms in his face had stopped. He had reached a point of shared vulnerability with Isabella that gave him a new kind of strength. He didn't need to hide anymore. Julian, Dominic said, looking his oldest friend in the eye. You've seen my face all morning. You know I'm telling the truth now. I'm not your enemy. But if you keep holding that gun, you're the piece that has to be removed. As the clock on the gallery wall ticked toward the final hour, Dominic realized the final, cruelest twist of the night. The stranger, the arbiter, wasn't just an actor. He was still in the penthouse waiting for the final move. And that move required Dominic to return to the board and play one last hand, with his face wide open and his soul on display. The penthouse was colder than it had been an hour ago. The dawn light was no longer gray. It was a harsh, unforgiving white that exposed every speck of dust and every drop of spilled scotch. The ageless stranger, the arbiter, was still there, sitting in the same chair, his hands folded over the head of a silver cane. The chessboard sat between them, a graveyard of ivory and ebony. You've returned, the arbiter said, his voice a low, melodic vibration. Most men would have tried to run for the border. But then you can't run when your face is screaming your destination to every bird on the wire, can you? Dominic slumped into his chair. He was exhausted. The neurotoxin or the game, whatever was forcing his honesty, had reached a fever pitch. Every time he thought of his daughter, his eyes welled with a staggering, pathetic grief. Every time he thought of the men he had killed to reach this throne, his mouth curled into a snarl of self-loathing. He was a man stripped of his armor, sitting naked in front of his executioner. I want to end this, Dominic rasped. Endings are earned, not requested, the arbiter replied. Look at the board, Dominic. You are in the darkest hour. Your bishop, Julian, is compromised. Your queen, Isabella, is a hostage. And your pawn, well, the clock is ticking. Dominic looked down. The board had changed. It wasn't just pieces anymore. In the flickering light he saw the squares as city blocks. He saw the piece representing his daughter, the small wooden girl, standing on a square surrounded by black knights. The obstacle was insurmountable. To save the girl he had to surrender the digital keys to the city's infrastructure. A move that would hand absolute tyrannical power to the shadow conglomerate Elena worked for. But to refuse would mean the consensus would authorize the strike on the convent. There was no third option. No bluff. No hidden card. Because the moment he tried to think of a trick, the arbiter would see it on his brow. You're wondering if you can kill me before the clock strikes, the arbiter said, smiling thinly. Dominic's face immediately spasmed into a look of murderous, desperate intent, then slumped into a mask of defeat. I can't. You have guards I can't see. And even if I did, the checkmate is automated. Correct, the arbiter said. You are finally seeing the world as it is. No lies. No shadows. Just the cold, hard math of your own failures. Then the true weight of the darkest hour hit. A monitor on the wall flickered to life. It was a feed from the gallery. Julian was no longer holding the gun to Isabella's head. Instead, Elena's men had disarmed Julian and forced them both to their knees. "The bishop has fallen," the arbiter noted dispassionately. "And now the queen is in jeopardy." Dominic watched as Elena stepped into the frame, her face cold. She looked at the camera knowing Dominic was watching. She held up a thermal detonator. "The consensus decided that witnesses are no longer required, Dominic. Sign the keys over now or watch the gallery go first." Dominic's face was a chaotic storm. He was experiencing a neurological overload. The honesty was causing physical pain now. His muscles were cramping from the sheer force of the truth. He looked like a man being electrocuted by his own conscience. He loved Isabella. He loved his daughter. And he was being forced to choose which one would die so the other could live. He reached for the pen on the table, his hand shaking so violently he could barely grip it. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated despair, the kind of look that breaks anyone who sees it. I can't," Dominic sobbed. It was the first time he had cried since he was a child. The tears carved tracks through the expensive wine and sweat on his cheeks. "I can't choose. Please." "The king has no please in his vocabulary," the arbiter said, leaning in. "This is what checkmate feels like, Dominic. It's not just losing. It's the moment you realize that every move you ever made, every lie, every cheat, every stone-faced silence, brought you exactly to this chair at this minute, to lose everything you ever pretended to protect." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Dominic looked at the wooden girl on the board. He looked at Isabella on the screen. He felt the separation from everything he loved as a physical chasm, a void opening up beneath his feet. He was a man who had spent his life controlling the world, and now he couldn't even control his own eyelids. He felt the darkness closing in. The hope was gone. The game was rigged, the players were dead, and the king was alone. "I give up," Dominic whispered, his face settling into the hollow, empty stare of a man who has already died inside. "Just take it all. Take the city. Just let them go." The arbiter stayed silent, watching the clock. 5:58 a.m. The situation was hopeless. Dominic had surrendered, but in this game even surrender was a move that had to be played out to its bloody conclusion. The arbiter reached for the digital tablet to finalize the transfer of the city's infrastructure. A wise choice, Dominic. In the end, the truth is simply that you are a father before you are a king. A pity it took the destruction of your empire to realize it. But as Dominic's blurred eyes fell upon the mahogany board one last time, something shifted. It wasn't a move he had made tonight. It was a memory, a ghost of a lesson his father had whispered to him before the world turned cold. Dominic, a man who plays with a mask, only sees the shadows. A man who plays with his soul sees the light between them. Suddenly, the honesty that had been a paralyzing poison became a sudden, crystalline clarity. If his face was showing the truth, then the truth was his only weapon left. He realized that the arbiter, for all his perceived omniscience, was still reacting to what he saw on Dominic's face. The mentalist was reading this stone face that was now broken. But he was reading it based on the assumption that Dominic was still a man who feared loss. Before we see how Dominic flips this impossible board, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where losing everything finally made you feel free? That's the pivot point we're at right now. Drop a true in the comments if you've been there, and if you're rooting for a miracle, make sure you've subscribed to see how this ends. Dominic's eyes snapped to the screen showing the gallery. He saw Isabella. She wasn't begging. She was looking directly into the camera lens as if she could see him through the miles of fiber optic cable. Her lips moved, silent but clear. "Play the game, Dominic." She wasn't telling him to surrender. She was telling him to play. Dominic's face underwent a transformation that defied the neurotoxin. It didn't spasm. It didn't twitch with guilt. It began to radiate a singular, terrifyingly calm resolve. He realized the key. The game was bloodless because it was psychological. The checkmate wasn't a physical bomb, it was a series of commands. And if the system was built on the consensus of the families, then it was built on their shared greed. "You said I can't cheat the game," Dominic said, his voice regaining its iron resonance. His face was now a mask of such profound, joyful courage that the arbiter actually pulled back, his eyes narrowing. "What is this?" the arbiter whispered. "Why aren't you afraid?" "Because I finally see the board," Dominic growled. "You're reading my tells, but you're reading them wrong. You think I'm crying because I'm losing my daughter? I'm crying because I just realized how much I'm going to enjoy watching you fall. Dominic didn't sign the transfer. Instead, he grabbed the white queen, the one representing Isabella, and slammed it down on a square that was technically illegal, the center of the board right between the two kings. The move at 3:15 a.m., Dominic said, his face glowing with a triumphant, honest light. The one you thought was a cheat. I didn't hide a piece. I linked the accounts. If you take my queen, the digital keys don't go to the conglomerate. They go public. Every offshore account, every bribe, every secret of the 5 families. It all goes to the press in 10 seconds. This was the revelation. Dominic hadn't rigged the game to win power. He had rigged the game to be a suicide switch. The only reason that consensus could control him was because he had something to lose. But a man who is willing to lose everything is the only one who can truly win. The arbiter's composure shattered. For the first time, the ageless figure looked human and terrified. You're bluffing. You'd destroy yourself. You'd destroy the girl's future. Look at my face. Dominic roared, standing up, his chest heaving. Look at my eyes, you coward. Do I look like a man who is bluffing? The arbiter stared. He saw the truth. There was no flicker of hesitation. No shadow of a lie. Dominic was 100% prepared to burn the entire city to the ground to ensure no one could ever own his daughter or his wife again. The honesty was now a nuclear deterrent. On the screen in the gallery, Julian Thorne saw the shift. He saw Dominic's face on the monitor and he knew. Julian grabbed a hidden knife from his sleeve, the move he had been holding back, and slashed the zip ties on Isabella's wrists. The bishop had returned to the side of the king. The game is over, Dominic whispered, the clock hitting 5:59 a.m. The house rule is that the game decides destiny. And my destiny isn't to be a boss. It's to be free. The turning point was complete. The hunter had become the prey, and the man who couldn't lie had just told the most powerful truth in the history of the underworld. The penthouse felt like the interior of a bell that had just been struck. The resonance of Dominic's defiance hummed in the air, vibrating through the mahogany table and into the very marrow of his bones. 5:59 a.m. The digital clock on the wall didn't just track time anymore. It tracked the remaining seconds of an era. The arbiter's hands, once so steady and skeletal, were now white-knuckled as they gripped his silver cane. For the first time, the stranger looked at the chessboard not as a master, but as a victim of his own architecture. You're insane, the arbiter hissed. If those files go public, the 5 families will be hunted to the ends of the earth. You, Isabella the child, none of you will survive the week. It's not a win, Dominic. It's a massacre. Dominic stepped closer, his face a terrifyingly beautiful portrait of absolute authenticity. The neurotoxin was still coursing through him, but he had mastered it. He wasn't fighting the honesty, he was channeling it. His eyes were wide, clear, and burning with a fire that made the morning sun look dim. Justice usually looks like a massacre to the men who deserve it, Dominic said. Suddenly, the elevator doors hissed open. It wasn't the mercenaries. It was Julian Thorne, his suit stained with blood, leading Isabella into the room. They had fought their way out of the gallery the moment Dominic's suicide switch move had paralyzed Elena's team with the fear of exposure. Elena followed them, her gun drawn, but her aim was shaky. She was looking at the tablet in her hand. The progress bar for the public leak was at 92%. Stop it, Dominic. Elena screamed. I'll kill them both right now. I'll pull the trigger. Dominic didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the arbiter. His face showed no fear, only a deep, soulful peace that was more unnerving than any threat. Go ahead, Elena, Dominic said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. Look at my face. See if you can find the lie. If you kill them, I hit enter on the final bite. You'll be a corpse in a world that knows every sin you've ever committed before your body even hits the floor. But if you lower that gun, you might just have enough time to disappear. Elena looked at Dominic's face. He saw the truth. There was no bluff. There was no negotiation. He was a man who had already accepted his own death, and that made him a god in a room full of mortals. With a curse, she lowered the weapon and backed toward the private exit. She knew when the board had been flipped. The arbiter stood up, his regal posture crumbling. The game, it requires a winner, Dominic. The rules of the bloodless gambit demand a king. Then take the crown, Dominic said, reaching down and flicking his own king over. The ivory piece clattered across the wood, spinning until it came to rest at the arbiter's feet. I resign. I'm no longer a player. I'm just a man. 6 a.m. The clock chimed, a deep, sonorous ring that echoed through the skyscraper. On the monitor, the feet of the convent changed. The Black Knights, the mercenaries, were retreating. They had received the stand-down order. The consensus had broken. Faced with total exposure or letting one man walk away, the families had chosen survival. The tension that had held Dominic's face in a vice for 6 hours suddenly snapped. The microscopic needles under his skin vanished. The heat receded. He reached up and touched his jaw. It was soft. He could smile. He could frown. He was back in control. But he didn't use his newfound control to hide. He turned to Isabella. She was standing by the window, the dawn light catching the tears on her cheeks. Dominic walked to her, his steps no longer heavy with the weight of the moves. He took her hands in his. For the first time in their entire marriage, he didn't have to wonder if she knew what he was thinking. "Isabella," he whispered. "I saw it," she said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and awe. "I saw all of it, Dominic. I saw the man you were trying to hide. I saw the father. I saw you." The final twist wasn't a move on the board or a hidden weapon. It was the realization that the stone face hadn't been protecting his family. It had been the wall keeping them apart. By losing his ability to lie, he had gained the ability to truly love. Julian stepped forward, looking at the two of them. He placed a heavy hand on Dominic's shoulder. "The city is going to be chaos by noon, Dominic. The families are in retreat, but the vacuum won't stay empty for long. We need to go." Dominic nodded. He looked back at the arbiter who was still staring at the fallen king. "The game is over," Dominic said. "Tell the consensus that Dominic Corleone died at dawn. And tell them if they ever look for the man who replaced him, he won't be hard to find. He'll be the one who has nothing left to hide." As they turned to leave, the arbiter spoke one last time, his voice a mere shadow. "You cheated, Dominic. You used the truth to win a game of lies." Dominic paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. He didn't offer a stony glare. He offered a genuine, weary, and triumphant smile. That wasn't a cheat. That was the only move that mattered. The journey away from the skyscraper felt like a slow ascent from the depths of the ocean. Dominic, Isabella, and Julian traveled in silence, but it was no longer the heavy, suspicious silence of the Mafia. It was the quiet of survivors catching their breath. As the city blurred past the windows of the car, Dominic looked at his reflection in the glass. His face was tired, etched with lines he hadn't noticed before, but it was his. The twitching was gone. The stone face was buried in the rubble of the penthouse. They reached the convent just as the morning bells were ringing for prayer. The stone walls were ancient and cool, draped in ivy that shimmered with dew. Dominic's heart, which had survived the most brutal psychological war imaginable, felt like it might finally break from the sheer weight of anticipation. He stepped into the courtyard. There, sitting by a fountain, was the little girl from the monitor. "Sylvia." She looked up, her eyes, Dominic's eyes, widening as she saw the man approaching. She hadn't seen him in 3 years. He had kept himself away, believing his presence was a stain on her purity. "Papa?" she whispered, the word a fragile bird in the morning air. Dominic didn't stay back. He didn't calculate the risk. He ran. He scooped her up, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time in his life he let the world see him crumble. He sobbed openly, his shoulders shaking, his heart exposed for anyone to see. Behind him, Isabella stood with Julian, her hand over her heart, a look of profound peace settling over her features. She finally had the man she loved, and he finally had a soul he was allowed to keep. Julian, the man who had been a bishop, but chose to be a friend, nodded to Dominic from the gate. He wouldn't be coming with them into this new life. His own sins were too heavy for the quiet of a garden, but he had seen his brother to safety. With a final, knowing look, Julian turned back toward the city, the keeper of a legend that would be whispered in the shadows for generations. The story of the boss who won by losing. As the weeks turned into months, the world of Dominic Corleone transformed. They moved to a small coastal town far from the reach of the consensus. He changed his name, but he never changed his face. He became a man known for his honesty, A man whose word was iron because he no longer knew how to craft a lie. Isabella restored old paintings in a small studio by the sea, and Sophia grew up in the sunlight, never knowing the shadow of the mahogany board or the cold eyes of the arbiter. Dominic would often sit on the porch at dusk watching the waves, thinking about the night he cheated destiny. He realized then that the game hadn't been a punishment. It had been a gift. It had stripped away the king to save the man.